The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic one final time. 23 years he had served as a Queen's Guard, and in all those years, the rules had been crystal clear. Stand perfectly still, eyes forward, no speaking, no moving, no breaking character under any circumstances. The tourist could shout, wave, even try to make him laugh, but a Queen's Guard remained as unmovable as the ancient stones beneath his feet. James had seen it all during his decades of service. Countless visitors from every corner of the world would gather around him and his fellow guards, cameras clicking frantically as they tried to capture the perfect photo with the famous red-coated sentries. Children would giggle and wave, adults would pose dramatically, and teenagers would attempt increasingly ridiculous antics to get a reaction. Through it all, James and his colleagues remained statue-like, their famous bearskin hats casting shadows over their stoic faces. The protocol was sacred, drilled into every guard from their first day of training. They were not just soldiers. They were living symbols of British tradition, representatives of centuries of royal history. Their silence and stillness were not just personal discipline but a matter of national pride. Breaking protocol wasn't just frowned upon. It could mean the end of a career, a court-martial, or worse. But this particular Tuesday morning felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the crisp autumn air that carried whispers of change, or maybe it was the unusually diverse crowd gathering in the courtyard. James had noticed more families with elderly grandparents, more wheelchairs navigating the historic grounds, more children with visible disabilities accompanied by patient caregivers. As James took his position at the main entrance, his commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, made his usual rounds. "Remember, gentlemen," Reynolds said in his clipped military tone, "we have several VIP tours scheduled today and the press will be present for the changing of the guard ceremony. Maintain absolute discipline, no exceptions." The words echoed in James's mind as he assumed his post. His rifle rested against his shoulder, his jaw set in the familiar rigid line that had become second nature over the years. The first wave of tourists began to arrive, their excited chatter filling the morning air. Camera phones appeared immediately, and James felt the familiar weight of dozens of eyes studying his every detail. A group of American tourists gathered nearby, their tour guide explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. "These soldiers are highly trained members of the British Army," the guide explained. "They're not just for show. They're active duty military personnel with real responsibilities. The tradition of remaining motionless dates back centuries and represents the unwavering dedication to protecting the royal family." James had heard similar explanations thousands of times, but today the words seemed to carry extra weight. He thought about his own journey to this position, the rigorous training, the pride his family felt when he first donned the uniform, the genuine honor he felt in serving his country in this unique way. As the morning progressed, the crowds grew thicker. A school group from Germany posed excitedly nearby, their teacher trying to maintain order while explaining British royal customs. A Japanese family took turns standing next to James, bowing respectfully before each photo. An elderly couple from Australia sat on a nearby bench, the husband pointing out various architectural details to his wife, who listened with obvious delight despite her apparent difficulty hearing. It was then that James noticed her, a little girl in a bright pink wheelchair, probably no more than 8 years old, positioned at the back of a growing crowd. Her parents stood behind her, and James could see the disappointment in their faces as they realized their daughter couldn't see past the wall of adults in front of them. The child craned her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the famous guard, but it was hopeless. The girl's mother leaned down and whispered something in her ear. The child nodded sadly, and James watched as the family began to move away, clearly deciding it wasn't worth the struggle to push through the crowd. In that moment, something stirred deep within James's chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with simple human compassion. He had seen countless disappointed tourists over the years, people who couldn't get the perfect photo or the ideal viewing spot. But something about this particular situation felt different. Maybe it was the quiet acceptance in the child's face, or the gentle way her parents tried to console her without making her feel like she was missing out. Whatever it was, James felt a crack forming in the armor of protocol that had protected him for over 2 decades. The crowd continued to swell around his position, and James maintained his stoic pose even as his mind raced. He thought about why he had joined the Guard in the first place, not just to serve his country but to represent the very best of what Britain could be. Was rigid adherence to protocol always the highest form of service, or were there moments when true service required something more? As the morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the ancient courtyard, James found himself at a crossroads he had never expected to face. The rules were clear, his duty was defined, but his heart was beginning to whisper a different kind of guidance. In just a few hours, this internal struggle would lead to a decision that would not only change one little girl's day, but would also challenge everything James thought he knew about duty, service, and what it truly meant to guard not just a building or a tradition, but the very spirit of human kindness itself. The stage was set for a moment that would ripple far beyond the castle walls, touching hearts around the world and reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful acts of service come not from following rules, but from following one's heart. The crowd around James continued to grow as tour buses arrived in steady succession. French teenagers snapped selfies, elderly couples from Canada marveled at the pageantry, and a group of businessmen from India discussed the historical significance of the uniforms. Through it all, James maintained his rigid posture, but his attention kept drifting to the family with the little girl in the wheelchair, who had moved to a nearby bench. From his peripheral vision, he could see them clearly now. The father, a man in his 30s with kind eyes and worry lines etched around them, was trying to lift his wife's spirits. The mother kept glancing back toward the guards with obvious longing, and James realized she had probably been looking forward to this moment for months, maybe even planning this trip around it. But it was the little girl who captured his attention completely. She sat quietly in her bright pink wheelchair, decorated with colorful stickers and a small stuffed elephant attached to one armrest. Her legs were covered with a cheerful blanket, and despite her obvious disappointment, she was smiling at her parents, clearly trying to make them feel better about the situation. There was something remarkable about her resilience, the way she seemed more concerned about her parents' feelings than her own missed opportunity. A tour guide approached James's position with a group of visitors, launching into the standard explanation about the Queen's Guard traditions. The guards undergo months of intensive training, she explained, not just in military protocol but in the art of remaining completely motionless. They're not allowed to speak, smile, or acknowledge the crowd in any way. It's considered one of the most challenging ceremonial duties in the world. One tourist, a teenager from Australia, decided to test this claim. He started making funny faces at James, trying increasingly ridiculous expressions to get a reaction. When that failed, he began doing a silly dance, much to the amusement of his friends and the embarrassment of his parents. James had seen this routine countless times before, but today it felt particularly thoughtless. Here was a healthy young man, blessed with mobility and opportunity, using it to mock a soldier's dedication to duty. Meanwhile, just a few yards away, a little girl who would have given anything just to get close enough for a simple photo sat quietly accepting her limitations. The contrast struck James with unexpected force. As the crowd shifted and moved, James caught sight of other visitors struggling with accessibility issues. An elderly man with a walker was having difficulty navigating the uneven cobblestones. A woman with a guide dog stood uncertainly at the edge of the crowd, clearly wanting to experience the ceremony but unable to find a safe path through the masses of people. A family with a young boy who appeared to have autism was trying to maintain some distance from the noise and chaos while still participating in the experience. The tourism industry at Royal sites had grown enormously over the years, but the infrastructure and protocols hadn't always evolved to accommodate everyone who wanted to share in these historic moments. James had never really noticed this before. His training had taught him to see crowds as abstract challenges to security and order, not as collections of individuals with unique needs and dreams. But today was different. Today, James found himself seeing past the uniform mass of tourists to the individual stories within it. The elderly couple holding hands as they experienced something they had dreamed about for decades. The single mother who had probably saved for months to bring her children to see the castle. The group of veterans, some in wheelchairs themselves, paying quiet respect to a fellow serviceman. A commotion near the main entrance caught James's attention. A tour group had arrived from a local care facility, adults with various developmental disabilities accompanied by patient caregivers. They were clearly thrilled to be there, some clapping with excitement, others staring in wonder at the guards. But as they tried to find a good viewing spot, it became obvious that the crowds weren't naturally making space for them. One of the caregivers, a woman in her 50s with tired but kind eyes, was doing her best to help her charges see the ceremony. She stood on her tiptoes describing what she could see over the crowd's heads to those who couldn't see for themselves. James watched as she patiently answered the same questions repeatedly, her voice growing hoarse but never losing its gentle tone. "Can we see the soldier?" asked a man with Down syndrome, probably in his 20s, his face bright with anticipation. "We're trying, David," the caregiver replied softly. "There are a lot of people here today." James felt something shift inside him as he watched this interaction. These weren't just tourists seeking entertainment. They were people reaching out to connect with something larger than themselves, seeking to be part of a tradition that belonged to all citizens, not just those fortunate enough to be tall, mobile, or quick enough to secure the best spots. The official changing of the guard ceremony was still an hour away. But already James could see how the dynamics would play out. The most aggressive tourists would claim the prime viewing spots, while those who needed accommodation would be pushed to the margins or miss out entirely. It was a pattern he had observed countless times, but never really considered from the perspective of those being excluded. His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, made another pass through the area, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of breach in protocol. As he walked past James, he nodded slightly, a tiny acknowledgement that everything was proceeding according to plan. But for the first time in his career, James wondered if the plan itself might be incomplete. The little girl in the pink wheelchair had started reading a book, clearly resigned to making the best of the situation. Her parents were pointing out other features of the castle, trying to salvage the experience. But James could see in their body language that this was not how they had imagined this moment would unfold. As the minutes ticked by and the crowd continued to swell, James found himself at an internal crossroads that had nothing to do with military strategy, and everything to do with the kind of man he wanted to be. The uniform he wore represented service, honor, and duty. But what did those values really mean when faced with simple human need? The moment arrived without fanfare or ceremony. It was simply a quiet instant when James realized that 23 years of unwavering protocol was about to meet something more powerful than military tradition. Basic human compassion. The crowd had reached its peak density. A sea of tourists pressed together in anticipation of the changing of the guard ceremony. James could see the little girl in the pink wheelchair even more clearly now, and what he observed broke something inside him. She had put away her book and was stretching her neck, standing up slightly in her chair, desperately trying to catch just a glimpse of what everyone else was seeing so easily. Her parents had moved closer, her father now attempting to lift her up for a better view. But the angle was awkward and clearly uncomfortable for everyone involved. The mother was apologizing to people behind them for blocking their view, even though she was simply trying to help her daughter experience what they had traveled so far to see. James had witnessed thousands of disappointed tourists over the years, but something about this family's quiet dignity in the face of disappointment struck him differently. They weren't demanding special treatment, weren't complaining loudly, weren't making a scene. They were simply trying their best to adapt to a situation that wasn't designed with their needs in mind. The internal debate that had been building in James's mind all morning reached a crescendo. Every fiber of his military training screamed at him to maintain position, to follow protocol, to remember that his individual actions could have consequences far beyond this single moment. Breaking the cardinal rule of the Queen's Guard wasn't just about him. It could reflect on his entire unit, his commanding officers, even the institution itself. But another voice, one that seemed to come from a deeper place than his training, whispered a different kind of wisdom. What was the point of protecting tradition if that tradition became a barrier to the very values it was supposed to represent? What was the meaning of service if it excluded those who most needed to feel included? The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. James took a breath that seemed to contain 23 years of rigid adherence to rules, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he began to move. It started with just his eyes. Instead of staring straight ahead into the middle distance as he had been trained, James allowed his gaze to shift downward and to the side, making direct eye contact with the little girl. The moment their eyes met, her face transformed. The resigned disappointment melted away, replaced by pure wonder and delight. But James wasn't finished. Moving with deliberate care, he shifted his entire stance slightly, turning just enough to face the little girl more directly. The movement was subtle enough that most of the crowd didn't notice immediately, but to the little girl and her family, the gesture was unmistakable. This famous stoic guard was acknowledging them specifically. Then James did something that sent ripples of excitement through the entire crowd. He smiled. Not a broad, theatrical grin, but a gentle, genuine smile directed specifically at the little girl. The effect was electric. People began to notice, phones came up, and whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Oh my goodness, he's looking at her," the mother whispered, tears suddenly springing to her eyes. But James wasn't done yet. Moving with the same careful precision he used in all his ceremonial duties, he raised his free hand, the one not holding his rifle, and gave the little girl a small, dignified wave. The crowd around them erupted in delighted murmurs and the rapid clicking of camera phones. The little girl's response was everything James had hoped for, and more. Her face lit up with pure joy, and she waved back enthusiastically, bouncing slightly in her wheelchair with excitement. Her parents were openly crying now, not from sadness but from the unexpected kindness of this moment. James held the interaction for several seconds, maintaining eye contact with the little girl, his smile never wavering. He could hear the crowd's growing excitement, could sense his fellow guards nearby probably wondering what was happening, could imagine Captain Reynolds's reaction when he inevitably learned about this breach of protocol. But in that moment, none of those concerns mattered. What mattered was the pure happiness radiating from a little girl who had been given something she never expected: recognition, acknowledgement, and inclusion in a tradition that had seemed beyond her reach. The interaction concluded as carefully as it had begun. James gave the little girl one final gentle nod, a gesture that seemed to say, "This moment was for you," before slowly returning to his traditional stance. But something had fundamentally changed. The rigid statue had revealed the warm human being underneath, and that revelation had transformed not just the little girl's experience, but the entire atmosphere around them. Word of what had happened began to spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. People who had missed the initial interaction were getting excited descriptions from those who had witnessed it. Camera phones were being checked and rechecked, with people making sure they had captured the magical moment. "Did you see that?" one tourist asked another excitedly. The guard broke protocol to acknowledge that little girl. "I've never seen anything like it." The little girl herself seemed to glow with happiness. She kept looking back at James as if making sure the moment had really happened. And each time she caught his eye, he would give her the slightest hint of a smile, just enough to confirm that yes, this special connection was real. Her parents were struggling to compose themselves, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness they had just witnessed. The father kept wiping his eyes while the mother held her daughter's hand tightly, both of them clearly understanding that they had just experienced something far more meaningful than a typical tourist photo opportunity. James maintained his post with renewed purpose. He had broken protocol, yes, but he had done so in service of something larger than rules and regulations. He had served the true spirit of what the Queen's Guard represented. Not just tradition and discipline, but the very best of human character and British values. The ripple effects of James's simple act of kindness began to spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Within minutes of his interaction with the little girl, something remarkable started happening throughout the crowd gathered at Windsor Castle. Other tourists, inspired by what they had witnessed, began to step aside and make room for visitors who had been struggling to see. The businessman from Mumbai, who had been recording everything on his phone, suddenly noticed the elderly gentleman with the walker and offered him his prime viewing spot. A group of university students from France, who had been playfully jostling for the best selfie angles, quietly moved back to create space for the care facility group that had arrived earlier. The little girl in the pink wheelchair had become an unofficial celebrity among the crowd. Strangers were approaching her family, sharing in their joy and asking about her experience. A professional photographer who had been documenting the castle for a travel magazine asked the parents' permission to take some photos, promising to send copies to their family. "What just happened here was extraordinary," the photographer explained to the parents. In 30 years of covering royal events, I've never seen a guard break protocol like that. Your daughter is part of something special. James maintained his official stance, but he could feel the energy of the crowd around him had completely transformed. What had started as a typical tourist gathering, somewhat pushy, focused on individual photo opportunities with little consideration for others, had evolved into something resembling a community. People were talking to each other, sharing stories, and most importantly, looking out for those who needed help. The woman with the guide dog, who had been hovering uncertainly at the edge of the crowd, found herself surrounded by helpful tourists who created a clear path and described what was happening for her benefit. The family with the autistic son discovered that other visitors were naturally giving them the space they needed, while still including them in the experience. Captain Reynolds, making his routine security check, immediately noticed the unusual atmosphere. The crowd was larger than normal, but paradoxically, it was also calmer and more organized. He observed the interactions with growing curiosity, not yet aware of what had triggered this change in dynamics. As he approached James's position, Reynolds noticed the guard seemed more alert and engaged than usual, though still maintaining proper military bearing. What the captain didn't see were the subtle glances James continued to exchange with the little girl, or the way several tourists were now specifically pointing him out to their children as an example of kindness and compassion. Meanwhile, the story was already beginning to spread beyond the castle walls. Several tourists had captured James's interaction on their phones, and social media posts were starting to appear with captions like, "Queen's Guard breaks protocol to acknowledge disabled child," and "Most beautiful moment at Windsor Castle today." One video, posted by an American tourist named Sarah Chen, showed the entire interaction from start to finish. Her commentary, recorded as she filmed, captured the emotional impact of the moment. "Oh wow, look at this. The guard is looking right at this little girl in the wheelchair. He's actually smiling at her. And now he's waving. I'm literally crying right now. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The little girl's parents, Thomas and Emma Richardson, were still processing what had happened. They had brought their daughter Lucy to Windsor Castle as part of a week-long trip to London, a journey they had planned for over a year and saved for much longer. Lucy had been diagnosed with spina bifida at birth, and while she had never let her disability define her spirit, there had been countless moments over her 8 years when the world seemed designed for everyone except her. "Mummy, did you see?" Lucy kept asking, her eyes bright with wonder. "The soldier saw me. He smiled at me specially." Emma Richardson struggled to find words. As a parent of a disabled child, she had become accustomed to disappointment, to attractions that weren't accessible, to experiences that had to be modified or missed entirely. She had learned to prepare Lucy for letdowns while trying to maintain her daughter's natural optimism, but this moment was different. This was inclusion, recognition, and kindness when they had expected none. Thomas Richardson, a mechanic from Birmingham, found himself thinking about the guard's decision to break protocol. As someone who worked within systems and rules himself, he understood the risk the guard had taken. That soldier didn't have to do what he did, he told his wife quietly. He chose to see Lucy as a person, not just another tourist. That takes real character. The changing of the guard ceremony was still 30 minutes away, but the crowd was no longer restlessly waiting. Instead, people were engaged in conversations, sharing stories, and creating an atmosphere of community that was unusual for such tourist gatherings. Children were making friends across language barriers, elderly visitors were finding comfortable places to sit, and everyone seemed more patient and considerate. James could hear fragments of these conversations, and each one reinforced his growing conviction that he had made the right choice. A young mother was explaining to her son about treating everyone with kindness. A grandfather was telling his granddaughter about the importance of including people who might be different. A teacher was using the moment to discuss empathy and compassion with her school group. But perhaps the most significant change was in James himself. For 23 years he had performed his duties with dedication and pride, but there had always been a distance between himself and the people he served. The uniform and the protocol had created a barrier that protected him from personal involvement, but also isolated him from the human connections that gave meaning to service. Today, for the first time, he felt truly connected to his purpose. He wasn't just a ceremonial figure representing tradition. He was a bridge between the institution he served and the people who came to experience it. His small act of kindness had reminded everyone present that behind the pageantry and protocol were real people with real hearts. The professional photographer approached James's position, maintaining a respectful distance while capturing images of the continuing interactions between the guard and various visitors. He had covered hundreds of royal events, but he sensed this was developing into something newsworthy, a human interest story that could resonate far beyond the typical tourist snapshots. As word continued to spread through social media and messaging apps, the crowd at Windsor Castle began to grow even larger. People were arriving specifically because they had heard about the guard who had shown extraordinary kindness to a disabled child. The story was taking on a life of its own, transforming from a single moment of compassion into a symbol of something larger about human decency and institutional humanity. The changing of the guard ceremony began precisely at noon, as it had for generations. But today's ceremony carried an electricity that none of the participants or spectators had experienced before. The crowd, now swelled by new arrivals who had heard about the morning's events, watched with unprecedented attention and respect. James participated in the ceremony with his usual precision, but he could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. He was no longer just another guard in a sea of red tunics and bearskin hats. He had become a symbol of something much more personal and meaningful. As he marched in perfect formation with his fellow guards, he could hear whispers rippling through the crowd. "That's him," people were saying. "That's the guard who was so kind to the little girl." Lucy Richardson had the best seat in the house, thanks to the kindness of strangers who had insisted she and her parents move to the front of the crowd. She watched the ceremony with rapt attention, her eyes never leaving James as he performed his duties. Every few minutes, when the formations allowed, he would catch her eye and give her the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Captain Reynolds, observing the ceremony from his command position, began to notice the unusual dynamics. The crowd was larger than typical, but also more engaged and respectful. There was less pushing, less shouting, and considerably more cooperation among the tourists. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, though he hadn't yet identified what. It was during the final phase of the ceremony, as the guards were returning to their posts, that Reynolds noticed something that made him pause. James's interaction with a specific section of the crowd seemed different, more personal, more connected. Following his guards' occasional glances, Reynolds spotted the little girl in the pink wheelchair and her beaming parents. The ceremony concluded to enthusiastic applause. But instead of the crowd immediately dispersing as usual, people lingered. They seemed reluctant to leave, as if they understood they had witnessed something special and wanted to savor the experience a little longer. Media attention began to intensify as journalists and photographers who had heard about the morning's events arrived at the castle. Sarah Chen's video had already been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. The hashtag #YourKindnessGuard was trending on Twitter, with people sharing their own stories of unexpected compassion and calling for more humanity in our daily interactions. Thomas Richardson found himself being interviewed by a reporter from the BBC. "It wasn't just that the guard acknowledged our daughter," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the way he did it, with such dignity and respect. He saw her as a person worthy of recognition, not just as someone to feel sorry for. That's what made it so special." Emma Richardson added, "Lucy has faced so many situations where she's been overlooked or forgotten, but today she felt truly seen and valued. That guard gave her something we could never have bought or arranged, a moment of pure acceptance and inclusion." The reporter, veteran journalist Margaret Thornton, had covered countless human interest stories, but she found herself genuinely moved by the family's account. "What struck me," she would later write, "was not just the guard's willingness to break protocol, but the family's gracious response to this unexpected kindness. Their gratitude revealed as much about their character as the guard's actions revealed about his." Meanwhile, James had returned to his post for the afternoon shift, but the dynamics around him had fundamentally changed. Instead of treating him as a stoic statue to be photographed, tourists were approaching with genuine respect and gratitude. Parents were bringing their children to meet the kind guard, and many were sharing their own stories of family members with disabilities. One elderly woman, visiting from Canada with her grandson who had autism, approached James's position with tears in her eyes. Though she respected the protocol and didn't expect him to respond, she spoke softly so only he could hear. "Thank you for showing the world that kindness matters more than rules sometimes. My grandson saw what you did for that little girl, and it's given him hope that people will see past his differences too." James maintained his official posture, but the words struck him deeply. He was beginning to understand that his simple gesture had resonated far beyond one little girl's experience. It had become a symbol of inclusion, acceptance, and the power of small acts to create large changes. Captain Reynolds, having pieced together what had occurred, found himself in an unusual position. Technically, James had violated clear protocols that existed for good reasons. The Queen's Guard maintained their stoic reputation precisely because it was unbreakable, reliable, and consistent. But the positive response from the public and the obvious good intentions behind the action complicated any potential disciplinary response. More importantly, Reynolds was a career military officer who had spent his life in service to his country and its people. The same values that demanded adherence to protocol also celebrated courage, compassion, and putting service above self-interest. James's actions seemed to embody these deeper military values, even while technically violating surface-level rules. As the afternoon progressed, more stories emerged from witnesses to the morning's events. The Care Facility group had reached out to local media to share how the Guard's kindness had inspired other tourists to be more inclusive and helpful. The elderly man with the walker spoke about how strangers had offered assistance and companionship after witnessing the Guard's compassion. Lucy Richardson herself had become something of a celebrity, but she handled the attention with remarkable grace for an 8-year-old. When asked by a journalist what she thought about the Guard's actions, she said simply, "He was nice to me when he didn't have to be. That's what makes someone special." The story was now spreading internationally, with news outlets in dozens of countries picking up the account of the Queen's Guard, who chose compassion over protocol. Social media was filled with people sharing their own experiences of unexpected kindness, creating a global conversation about the importance of seeing and valuing every individual. James, still at his post as the afternoon wore on, could feel the weight of this expanding attention. What had begun as a simple human response to a child's disappointment was becoming something much larger, a symbol of hope, a reminder of shared humanity, and perhaps most importantly, a demonstration that institutions and traditions could be both respected and humanized. As evening approached and his shift neared its end, James reflected on the day that had changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including inevitable conversations with his superiors about protocol and consequences. But tonight, he would go home knowing that he had used his position not just to serve tradition, but to serve the very best of human nature. 3 months later, Sergeant James Mitchell stood in the same spot at Windsor Castle, but everything had changed. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across the cobblestone courtyard, but the atmosphere surrounding the Queen's Guard had been transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The story of his interaction with Lucy Richardson had become one of the most widely shared feel-good stories of the year. Major news outlets across the globe had featured the account, and the video of their exchange had been viewed millions of times. More importantly, it had sparked a broader conversation about accessibility, inclusion, and the power of small acts of kindness to create meaningful change. The morning after his protocol-breaking gesture, James had been called into Captain Reynolds' office expecting disciplinary action. Instead, he found himself in a meeting that included not only his commanding officer, but also representatives from the royal household and the Ministry of Defense. "Sergeant Mitchell," Captain Reynolds had begun, "technically you violated clear protocols yesterday. However, the response to your actions has been overwhelmingly positive, and more importantly, they appear to have embodied the very values we're meant to represent as servants of the Crown." The representative from the royal household, a dignified woman named Lady Catherine Pemberton, had smiled warmly at James. "Her Majesty has been informed of the incident and your subsequent actions. She wanted me to convey that while protocol exists for important reasons, She has always believed that true service sometimes requires wisdom to know when compassion should take precedence. Rather than facing punishment, James found himself at the center of a remarkable shift in policy. The royal household, working with disability advocacy groups, had implemented new guidelines for ceremonial duties that created specific opportunities for guards to acknowledge and interact with visitors who might benefit from special recognition. The changes weren't dramatic. They maintained the essential dignity and tradition of the Queen's Guard while creating moments for human connection. Designated times during each shift now allowed guards to engage with visitors who had special needs or circumstances, always within the bounds of security and ceremony. Lucy Richardson had become something of an ambassador for this new approach. Her family had been invited back to Windsor Castle for the official announcement of the policy changes, and she had charmed everyone with her articulate advocacy for inclusion. The little girl who had simply wanted to see a guard up close had become a voice for ensuring that royal traditions remained accessible to all citizens. "Everyone should feel welcome here," Lucy had said during a brief interview, her confidence having grown remarkably over the months. "The castle belongs to everyone, not just people who can push to the front of crowds." The changes extended beyond just the Queen's Guard. Accessibility improvements had been made throughout royal properties, with better viewing areas for wheelchair users, clearer pathways for visitors with mobility aids, and trained staff to assist guests with special needs. The ripple effects of one moment of kindness had created systemic improvements that would benefit thousands of visitors. James had received hundreds of letters and emails from around the world. Parents of disabled children thanked him for seeing their sons and daughters as worthy of recognition. Military veterans praised him for understanding that true service sometimes required courage to break from convention. Teachers used his story in lessons about empathy and moral courage. One letter particularly moved him. It came from a young soldier serving overseas who wrote, "Your actions reminded me why we serve. It's not just about following orders or maintaining traditions. It's about protecting and honoring the dignity of every person we're sworn to serve." The professional development had been remarkable as well. James had been selected to help train new Queen's Guard recruits, specifically teaching them about balancing protocol with compassion. The training program now included modules on recognizing when human needs might require thoughtful flexibility within the bounds of duty. Captain Reynolds, initially concerned about the precedent James's actions might set, had become one of the strongest advocates for the new approach. "What Sergeant Mitchell showed us," he explained to new recruits, "is that our greatest strength isn't our ability to be unmovable, but our wisdom to know when movement serves a higher purpose." The Richardson family had maintained their connection with James and the Royal Guard. Lucy, now 9 years old, had grown in confidence and become an active advocate for disability awareness. She regularly spoke at schools and community events, always telling the story of the guard who chose kindness over rules. Her parents had established a small charity focused on making tourist attractions more accessible to families with disabled children. They worked with venues across the UK to implement simple changes that could make enormous differences in families' experiences. The Lucy Richardson Foundation had already helped dozens of historic sites improve their accessibility. "It started with one moment of recognition," Emma Richardson often said during fundraising events. "But it showed us that when people feel truly seen and valued, it creates ripples that can change entire systems." The international impact had been equally remarkable. Tourism boards from around the world had reached out to learn about the accessibility improvements at Windsor Castle. The story had inspired similar policy changes at historic sites across Europe, North America, and beyond. James often reflected on how one decision had transformed not just his own life, but the experiences of countless others. The rigid protocols he had followed for over 2 decades hadn't disappeared, but they had evolved to become more human, more inclusive, and ultimately more meaningful. The crowds at Windsor Castle were different now too. Word had spread about the more welcoming atmosphere, and families with disabled members specifically planned visits, knowing they would be treated with dignity and consideration. The tourist experience had become richer for everyone, as visitors witnessed moments of inclusion and kindness alongside the traditional pageantry. On this particular morning, 3 months after the original incident, James noticed a familiar sight. A young boy in a wheelchair, probably about 10 years old, was struggling to see over the crowd with his parents. But this time the response was immediate and natural. Other tourists automatically made space. The boy's family was guided to an accessible viewing area, and when James caught the child's eye during his patrol, he was able to give him an official acknowledgement within the new protocols. The boy's face lit up with the same wonder Lucy had shown months earlier, but now this moment was part of the expected experience rather than a protocol-breaking exception. The child's parents approached a nearby guard afterward to express their gratitude, and James overheard the response. "Every visitor deserves to feel welcome here. That's what service means." As his shift ended that day, James walked through the castle grounds with a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent over 2 decades protecting tradition, but he had learned that the most powerful way to honor tradition was to ensure it remained alive, relevant, and accessible to new generations. Lucy Richardson and her family were visiting again that weekend, part of a documentary being filmed about the changes at royal sites. When James saw her, now confidently navigating the castle grounds and chatting excitedly with other children, he realized that his moment of decision had created something far more valuable than a viral video or positive publicity. It had created lasting change that would benefit countless families for years to come. More importantly, it had demonstrated that institutions could evolve without losing their essential character, that rules could be honored while still prioritizing human dignity, and that sometimes the most profound act of service was simply seeing another person as worthy of recognition and kindness. The story that began with one guard's choice to break protocol had become a testament to the power of compassion to transform not just individual moments but entire systems. And every day, as new visitors experienced the warmth and inclusion that had become part of the Windsor Castle tradition, James knew that his decision to choose humanity over hierarchy had been worth every risk he had taken. The little girl in the pink wheelchair had received her moment of recognition. But in doing so, she had helped create a legacy of inclusion that would extend far beyond any single interaction, touching lives and changing experiences for generations of visitors to come.